So let me start right away. So first, what do I mean by collusion? So by collusion, we take the most traditional economic sense, which means that the rival sellers in some manner, they arrive at an understanding as to what prices to charge or what outputs to produce or both. So in other words, by collusion, we mean the producers, they form a cartel to limit competition and to increase their profits. So as we all know that cartel activities can harm consumer surplus and also social welfare. Quoted from the Council of Economic Advisors 2016, collusion is still one of the biggest impediments to competition nowadays. So explicit collusion is illegal almost all over the world. So the antitrust authorities are trying very hard to curb the cartel activities. During the 20 years since 1990, there have been more than 1,000 price fixing cartels that have been under investigation, and about 1.5 trillion US dollar amount of sales have been affected by these cartel activities globally. Even nowadays, antitrust investigations has been also very active. So here I'm listing a few recent ongoing cases. For instance, this Bumblebee is a producer of the canned tuna food. The CEO of this company has recently been sentenced to 3 years in jail for conspiracy in the product market and for price fixing. And the 4 largest US railway carriers recently are also facing a civil suit for their price fixing behavior in the market. There's also a Florida Cancer Specialists Research Institute, which has been recently fined for 100 million US dollars for agreeing not to compete with its competitors in Southwest Florida. So unlike the most papers studying collusion in the IO literature, where people assume that it is the firms that decide on whether to collude or not, our paper takes a slightly different angle. We look inside the black box of the firms, by which we mean that we focus on the wedge between shareholders and managers' incentive to collude. So such a wedge can come from several sources. The first source is that managers as individuals, they have more reputation and career concerns than the shareholders who are usually anonymous. And then the second source is more specific to the legal or institutional environment. Individual decision makers in the United States, they can face criminal sanctions for participating in cartel. And this kind of criminal punishment is usually not something that anonymous shareholders has to face. So these kinds of so these two sources create this wedge that makes the individual decision makers, the managers, they are less willing to participate in collusion. So that if collusion is in the best interest of the shareholders, they can always try to align the manager's incentives through certain types of executive compensation design. And that this is going to be the focus of our paper. So before talking about the detail of the compensation, let me first brief you the antitrust law enforcement environment in the United States, because our paper is going to be focusing on the US firms. So in the US, Sherman Act prohibits hardcore collusions, which include things like price fixing, market allocation, bid rigging. So there are 2 law enforcement agencies. First is the Department of Justice, specifically the Antitrust Division, and then the second is the Federal Trade Commission. So antitrust cases can be both criminal or civil cases. In the area of criminal enforcement, the Department of Justice will have the sole authority. If a collusion is convicted, the legal sanction can go against both the corporate and the individuals in the United States. So this is slightly different from some other places in, like Europe. So for the corporates, the fine usually, the punishment usually involves monetary fines. For individuals, it can be either monetary fines or imprisonment punishment. So this figure over here shows the number of antitrust case filings in each year since 1990s. As we can see from this green line, the number of cases against the corporates has been going down over time. On the other hand, from this blue line, we can see that the cases against individual defendants has been going up. So this picture basically shows us a trend of the law enforcement in the United States, which is to hold the individual decision makers more and more accountable. So this kind of legal environment minimizes managers' intrinsic motivation to participate in collusion. However, from the shareholders' perspective, if the overall sanctioning is relatively weak, they may still find the collusion beneficial or the optimal strategy. In this case, they may want to give additional or extrinsic motivations to the managers to motivate collusive strategies. And that is what we are going to explore in this paper. So we're going to focus on the relationship between executive compensation and the competition law enforcement. We are going to be focusing on CEO compensation because collusive decisions are usually taken at the top management to ensure the coordination within the organization between different layers of the management. We ask two specific research questions. The first one is, how does CEO compensation adapt to certain changes in antitrust enforcement? And second one is, what implications does it have on the latent behaviors that firms undertake in the product market competition? So before showing you what we have found, let me first talk about, from a theoretical perspective, which features of executive compensation should we expect to be relevant for competition strategies in the product market? So we focus on two features of executive compensation. First one is the sensitivity of managerial pay to the performance of a rival firm. So here we can imagine that the contract or managerial pay is a function of the performance of both the own firm and the rival firm. Suppose the shareholders wants to reward managers based on outperforming their rival firms, or in other words, if they want to give relative performance evaluations to their managers, then this loading on the rival firm performance is going to be negative. In contrast, if the shareholders want to encourage collusive strategies or discourage aggressive competition in the product market, then they would like to put a more positive loading on the rival firm's performance. So this is the first feature we are going to examine. The second feature we focus on is the equity compensation, stocks and option grants. We think this is particularly relevant for two reasons. First is that equity compensation helps with aligning managers with shareholders' interest. So as mentioned before, managers may be unwilling to collude for their reputation concerns and for fearing the legal sanctioning, so that from the shareholders' perspective, if they want to encourage collusion, the most direct thing they can do is to give the managers more equity awards to align them with the shareholders. And then the second reason here is more specific to collusive equilibrium. So this is as pointed out by Spagnolo. Any collusive equilibrium is unstable by nature. So all the cartel members would have the incentive to deviate and undercut their peer firms and to have a large surplus in the current period. Because stock prices are forward-looking, if a firm deviates from a collusive arrangement, although the current period profits is very high, the market will know that this firm may face very severe punishment in the future, so that the stock price will reflect such potential punishment from the cartel peers. So in other words, stock price will be reduced, which discourage the firm managers from deviating from the firm first place. So in other words, by giving managers equity compensation, it effectively lowers the discount rate and discourages the deviating behaviors. So, so that it can help with stabilize the collusive equilibrium. So these are the two features we are going to look at in this paper. So what we do in this paper, we examine a recent regulatory reform that weakens antitrust enforcement for some firms. So this reform has decreased the probability of detecting a collusion, and in turn makes it more appealing for the shareholders to collude. However, we believe the detection probability of the of collusion cannot be reduced to zero. So the overall law enforcement is still working, so that as long as the detection rate is not zero, the wedge between managers and shareholders' incentive to collude would still preserve. So we expect that in response to such a regulatory reform, the shareholders may want to change certain aspects of CEO compensation structure to give more extrinsic incentives to encourage collusion. And specifically, we expect to see a more positive sensitivity of CEO pay to the rival firm's performance, as well as more equity grants to the CEOs. And what we find in the paper, so here is a preview, we find that after such a sudden decrease in antitrust enforcement for certain firms, we find these firms began to establish a more positive relation between their CEO's pay and the performance of competitors with whom a collusive arrangement is likely to be formed. I will be very specific about what I mean over here a little bit later. And second finding is that we find that the treated firms have also increased the equity compensation grants to their CEOs. And lastly, these firms that experienced the regulatory reform and changed their compensation structure, they have earned a higher profit margin, which is consistent with the outcomes of collusive equilibrium. All right, so now let me talk about the details of what exactly regulatory reform we were looking at. So this reform happened in 2013. The Department of Justice decided to close 4 out of its 7 regional offices that were originally dealing with antitrust cases. So these 4 offices are located in, were located in Atlanta, Cleveland, Dallas, and Philadelphia. So most of the regional coverage has been moved to the center, Washington, D.C., and some of the other cases were moved to the other 3 regional offices, which are in Chicago, New York, and San Francisco. So this decision to close the DOJ offices is primarily driven by budget cuts and is presumably exogenous to local economy. So we argue that this decision, the closure of this DOJ office, has made it harder for DOJ to police the regional cases. Here is a quote from the mayor of Cleveland. It says that closing Cleveland's field office will impair the Department of Justice's ability to pursue effective criminal enforcement of antitrust laws. So since 2013, DOJ has been shifting their focus from regional cases to more nationwide big cases. So how we make use of this reform? We first assume that geographic distance between the firms who are being monitored and the location of the monitoring agency matters for gathering information on the regulated firms. So we argue that after this regulatory change, it should be more challenging to detect the conspiracies in local markets, and in turn makes it more appealing for the shareholders to collude with the local competitors. So this reform gives us a nice setting for a difference in difference test. So we define our treated firms as follows. We require a firm has become further away from their covered antitrust offices, and we require the firm has at least 1 local competitors with whom they can potentially collude with. And of course, the control firms would be the firms whose covered DOJ office didn't change or had no local competitors at all. Okay, so this table here shows you the 23 states that have been affected by the closure of these 4 DOJ offices. And we counted the number of antitrust filings in these affected states and draw this dark line over here. As we can see that after 2013, the number of cases have been dropping, but there seems no much difference for the unaffected states. And we also decompose the cases into the local cases versus the non-local cases, and we find this sharp drop in case numbers is actually driven by local cases. We find, for instance, before 2013 in the affected states, on average, they have 1.5 local cases per year. After the shock, there has been 0.5. For unaffected states, this number also decreased. But if we scale the number of local cases by the non-local cases, we find that this ratio dropped very remarkably for the affected states, but it barely changed for the unaffected states. So this is telling us that this regulatory reform really affects the monitoring intensity in the local markets. And this is a suggestive evidence that firms seems to have been taking advantage of this reform. So what I'm plotting is the gross margin for the treated firms minus the gross margin of 3 matched control firms. What we can see is that before the shock, there seems no significant difference between the treated and control firms. But after the shock, the treated firms began to have a significantly higher gross margin. So this is consistent with a weakened competition environment for the treated firms. Okay, so now let me talk about the empirical results. So the first test we have done is to see whether CEO pay has become more positively related with the performance of local peer firms. So we define the local peer firms as the firms that has been headquartered within 200 miles and in the same industry where we define based on the Hellberg-Phillips product similarity score. In our sample, an average firm would have 1 local firm and 7 non-local, 1 local peer and 7 non-local peers. So the treatment variable is continuous variable, which is the change in distance between the firm's headquarters and its covering DOJ office. So we regress CEO total compensation on the stock return of the own firm and the average stock return of the local peer firms. On top of this, we interact these 2 returns with the post-2013 dummy and this treatment variable, which is the change in distance. We expect this coefficient beta 2 here to be negative and the beta 4 here to be positive. And this is exactly what we have found in the data. So this table is telling us that CEO pay has become more positively associated with the local peers' stock returns. So now a nature question is how to understand these positive coefficients. There are 2 possibilities. The first one is that firms have been removing the explicit relative performance provision from their CEO's compensation contract. In other words, if they have done this, it would make the pay to peer performance sensitivity less negative. And we tested this in the data and find this is not the case. The explicit provision is not quite sensitive to this reform. We think the possible reason is that there were only less than half of the firms in our sample had such provisions in 2012. If they don't have it, there's no way they can remove the provision. So this leaves us one explanation for this positive coefficient, which is that the firms or the board of directors must have been increasing the pay performance sensitivity in an implicit way. So we asked the question, is it possible for the board to do that? And we think the answer is yes. They can do that easily through changing the cash bonus or cash incentive component, which is quite flexible to adjust for in CEO compensation package. This is because the cash awards are usually paid on annual basis so that they can adjust the cash plans year by year. And secondly, for cash bonuses, the board of directors has much discretionary judgment to adjust. For instance, we find that many firms in our sample would say strategic goals is one of the performance metrics to determine CEO compensation. And we find close to 90% of the strategic goals will show up in the cash component of compensation, but not in the equity component. So here are some examples of what exactly it means by strategic goals. Things like strategic initiative, long-term contractual agreements, formation of joint ventures, capture the price opportunities, produce long-term growth, etc. So as you can see, these are very qualitatively described, and when it is used in the cash component, the board would have the say on how much they are going to pay at the end of the year. So we decompose total compensation into the cash compensation and equity component of compensation and redo the regression. We find that the positive sensitivity only shows up for the cash component. Okay, so what we have done next is to do a pairwise regression where we take all the focal firms and all the peer firms and match them together and create a matrix. So the benefit of doing this is that for each peer, we can have an indicator to indicate whether or not it is a local peer or non-local peer, so that we can see whether the change in sensitivity is really driven by the local peers. Another benefit for doing this pairwise regression is that we can control for extensive set of fixed effects. For instance, the pair fixed effects or peer firm interacted with year fixed effects. It would help us to control for many unobservable factors. So when we do this regression, we regress total compensation on treatment control peer firm's return and an indicator that this peer firm is a local firm. We find that this focal interaction is significant and positive. Okay, so that's the first test we have done. The second test we explored is whether or not the affected firms increase the equity compensation awards. Where here the treated firms are the ones whose field office has been moved further away and also had local competitors. In other words, this treatment variable is going to be this continuous variable changing in distance multiplied by an indicator variable that this firm has at least one local competitors. And then we regress the value of equity compensation as percentage of firm's market capitalization on the interaction of post-2013 dummy and the treatment variable. As we expected, we find this treatment effect to be significant and positive. To get some sense about the economic magnitude, this says that when stock awards, it says that stock awards to the CEO compensation increased by 0.5 basis point of firm's market capitalization for a firm with local peers when its distance from the field office increased by 100 miles. So this magnitude to us is quite big. All right, so these are our results on the changes in compensation structure. The next thing we want to know is a firm's outcomes, whether these changes in compensation structures is associated with a larger markup and more co-movement in performance among the competitors, because a successful collusion would imply large markups and co-movements in performance. So what I'm showing you here in these two figures is the suggestive evidence, where I cut the sample by whether or not the firm has increased the equity compensation after 2013. And then I plot the gross margin for the treated firms minus the gross margin of 3 matched control firms. As we can see that for the firms that have increased equity grants to their CEOs, the gross margin increased significantly after 2013, while this change is not that obvious for the firms that didn't change the equity compensation. The next thing we did is to test whether the difference in the treatment effect on the firm outcomes is significant or not in regressions. So we have run a regression as follows. So the dependent variable is going to be gross margin or stock return movements. We regress these two variables on the interaction of post-2013 dummy and the treatment variable, as well as the equity compensation awards to the CEO. We expect this coefficient on the triple interaction to be positive. And this is exactly what we have found in the data. It is true for both profit margin and the stock return movement, which is consistent with the argument that these firms with a better alignment through equity compensation, they have been earning a higher profit margin and have a higher return movement with their competitors after this regulatory reform. All right, so let me use the last few minutes to talk a little bit about our heterogeneity test. Based on our story, we expect these results should be stronger if the firm has a better governance structure. Here we are going to measure it by by the fraction of basic directors in the board of directors. So the idea here is that if the board has a better governance structure, they are more likely to design the compensation package for the interest of the shareholders. And this is exactly what we have found. Our results are concentrated among the firms with good board governance structure. The second thing we explored is that suppose Collusion has a larger personal cost for the CEO, then they may require a higher compensation from the monetary pay. So here we look at the proxy, which is whether or not the CEO is approaching a retirement age, because as we noticed before, if they participate in a cartel and being caught, they may be sanctioned to several years in jail. A retiring CEO may not be willing to do that. And to encourage them to compete less aggressively, the shareholders may have to give them more changes in compensation. And this is exactly what we have found. And last but not least, we expect our results to be much stronger among the firms that have a more concentrated geographic distribution of their business. So here we use the two measures. First is the geographic concentration of firms' subsidiaries. And the second is Garcia measure, which is the number of states mentioned in firms 10 case. We find that indeed our results is driven by the firms that are more localized. We have also done many placebo tests. For instance, we moved the event for year before 2013, and we found there's nothing, which rule out the concern that this could be driven by some general economic trend. And we have also interacted the treatment variable with all the control variables in our regression just to control for the potential alternative economic or policy changes that also occurred in 2013. Our result is not quite sensitive to this. And we also tried different definitions of industry and local peers. And our results are very robust to these choices. So to sum up, the main takeaway of our paper is that we argue executive compensation can be designed to motivate collusion. When the antitrust enforcement is relatively weak, aligning investors with managers' incentive might reduce customer welfare because it may give the managers more incentive to pursue a collusive strategy in the product market. And another implication of our findings is that this is about the legal enforcement. So nowadays, as we have seen from the beginning in the United States, the legal sanctioning is going against the individuals more and more. So our results indicates that sanctioning individuals rather than corporates can exaggerate the principal agency problem, and it seems to be acting as an effective way of deterring collusion. So that is all of our paper. Thank you very much.